When he walked into the room, silence followed him. No questions about my readiness, no gentle words. I found myself undoing the buttons of his shirt with trembling fingers, watching him look at me as though the outcome had already been decided. That evening, his touch wasn't like that of someone who cherished me. It was the touch of someone claiming what had been promised them. I allowed it to happen not from desire, but because nobody had ever taught me that saying no was an option. Have you ever wondered about the true nature of love? When does it truly start? When does it fade? And can genuine affection grow from complete silence? Stay with us and hit that subscribe button as we dive into tales that don't begin with consent, yet somehow might find their way to it. I walked away from the man who held my heart. While his child grew inside me, the house sat in complete stillness at 3 in the morning, the type of quiet that doesn't bring comfort, but presses down on your chest like an unspoken truth. The corridor lay in darkness, but I moved without needing light. This route had become second nature to me. Bare soles finding the carpet's edge, fingers grazing the wooden rail like remembered choreography in my grasp. I clutched one item, the ring he'd placed on my finger. It had never been the right size, always pressing too smugly, too icy, too alien, as if it sensed it didn't belong there. I hadn't worn it during our wedding ceremony. I hadn't worn it the next morning either. But tonight, before my departure, I slipped it on one final time to remember how it felt. I set it down on the oak table in the entryway, positioned where his eyes would surely find it. No written explanation, no farewell message, just the ring itself. I needed him to grasp what spoken words might only muddle. I was departing because my love for him had grown too heavy to bear. I eased the front door open carefully, mindful not to let the hinges protest, and stepped into the gentle embrace of the night. Gravel shifted under my shoes as I made my way toward the entrance, but I resisted the urge to turn around. Not just yet. The life within me stirred softly, a delicate movement deep in my abdomen. I pressed my palm there protectively. He has no idea, I murmured soundlessly, uncertain whether I meant the man I was leaving or the baby I carried. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps neither. At 23, I was abandoning everything I'd known. His estate, his surname, those unreadable gray eyes taking with me the one part of him I could never give back. Tears didn't come. Not when the breeze touched my face the way his hands once had. Not even when I noticed the porch light flicker behind me and felt a foolish spark of hope that he might chase after me. He didn't pursue me. But then, Nathaniel Hale had never been someone who ran after things. He gathered, he obtained. And once something became his, he secured it completely. I was meant to be among those possessions. Not my marriage to him happened because my father requested it. Actually, my father exchanged me for his financial security when I turned 21. One signature, one legal agreement, one cup of tea that remained untouched that evening in the Hale sitting room, where I sat between two men planning my future, as if discussing market investments. I barely knew him then. Nathaniel Hale stood 15 years my senior, a widower, wealthy, and by all accounts, completely unreachable. When our eyes first met, I thought his gaze was frigid. Later, I'd understand it wasn't coldness I saw. It was caution. The look of someone who'd been burned too many times to trust warmth. On our wedding night, he spoke fewer than 5 sentences to me. I can recall each one perfectly. Do you need anything? You don't have to pretend for anyone. This room is yours. I won't touch you unless you ask me to. And finally, when I remained silent, when I perched on the bed's edge with hands clenched so tightly they shook, he spoke the 5th sentence. But I will take what I've paid for. He didn't say it with cruelty or anger, just stated it as fact. A reality I didn't challenge, because some part of me already understood that resistance wouldn't alter the situation. Fighting wouldn't transform it into love, and yielding wouldn't make it hatred. So I gave him what was never supposed to be. Bartered. I gave him myself, though I never gave him my acceptance of that ring, until tonight. The gate creaked as I pushed it wide. My breathing hitched one final moment of uncertainty. One last hope that perhaps he was watching, that he understood, that he would prevent my leaving, but only silence responded. I stepped beyond the Hale property onto the main road bordered by sleeping cherry trees and breathed in the moist Oregon air as if it might wash away what I was abandoning. It didn't succeed. The air still carried his essence, cedarwood, whiskey, and something deeper, more complex. Like aged regret, I paused at the road's edge. Then gradually, I turned to look back. The house stood imposing against the darkness. Every window remained dark except one his study. Light glowed there. In that instant, I understood two things. First, he was awake. He had always been awake. Second, he had allowed my departure. Not because he felt nothing, but because he cared. And he believed I needed to leave to find my freedom. What he couldn't know was that I no longer wanted freedom. I wanted him. But this time, according to my own terms. This time because I chose him, not because someone else had. I took one final look at the house where I had been traded, kept, touched, and somewhere in its quietest corners loved. And I whispered to the wind, I'll return, but not for the ring. Not for the name, for the man, for the father of this child, for the heart he doesn't realize he gave me. Then I turned away, and I didn't look back again. Thought my first encounter with Nathaniel Hale wasn't at an altar, but at a table once reserved for afternoon tea gatherings, back when my mother still hosted them before the tea house behind our property was sold to settle legal obligations. I remember the chill that day, not from the weather, but from how my father's voice shifted when he asked me to sit down. Where's something appropriate? He said without meeting my eyes. Not too bold something. Modest. I chose my pale blue dress, the one Mama used to say was my lucky color. It felt wrong that day. Doubt the tea had already grown cold when I took my seat. Across from me sat a man I'd only seen in newspaper articles and glossy charity publications. Nathaniel Hale, widowed technology executive, known for funding libraries and never smiling in photographs. I remember thinking he resembled a specter more than a man. Too motionless, too refined, too exact. His gray suit remained unwrinkled when he moved. His eyes didn't react when they settled on me. This is my daughter, Emily, my father announced, as if introducing property rather than a person. Nathaniel offered me a slight nod. It's a pleasure. It didn't feel like one. My father served tea for three and outlined the arrangement as if discussing a business merger. The Hale family would provide financial assistance to prevent bankruptcy, restore our estate, and cover medical costs for my mother. In return, I would become Mrs. Nathaniel Hale. No dowry, no romance, just ink on paper. I remained silent for the first 10 minutes. I stared at the spoon resting against the saucer and imagined what might happen if I threw it. It was a childish thought, but it kept me breathing. When I finally found my voice, it sounded nothing like me. Why me? Nathaniel blinked. Your father said you were quiet. I'm not, I answered too quickly. Something flickered in his gaze. Not amusement, not anger, just something. I don't want a loud life, he said calmly. I want stability, silence, simplicity. I looked at my father, expecting him to intervene. He didn't. And just like that, it was decided. That evening, I stood before my bedroom mirror, holding the unsigned contract. Mama knocked softly and entered. Her eyes held a weariness I didn't understand until much later. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear and said, sometimes we love with our hands before our hearts learn how. Sometimes duty precedes dreams. I signed the document without reading it again. The wedding was scheduled for 1 week later. There was no dress fitting, no bridal shower, no mother-daughter shopping trips, just a courier who delivered a simple ivory gown and a set of instructions. The ceremony would be private, and punctuality was expected. When I arrived at the Hale estate for the first time, I was struck not by its grandeur, but by its silence. There were no voices, no laughter, no music, just walls that stood too perfectly straight. An air that smelled faintly of cedar, and well-thought Nathaniel didn't meet me at the entrance. It was his assistant, a woman named Laura, who took my coat, led me to a drawing room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a single vase of white lily. "He'll be down shortly," she said. "Everything's prepared." I sat on a velvet chair that didn't yield under me. My fingers fidgeted with the clasp of the purse I hadn't wanted to bring. I heard footsteps measured, quiet, deliberate. Then he appeared. Nathaniel looked exactly as he had in the tea house. Composed, unreadable, more monument than man. He didn't reach for me. He didn't smile. "Shall we?" was all he said. We signed the marriage certificate in the study across from the fireplace where the logs hadn't been lit. The officiant mumbled something about vows, but Nathaniel and I never looked at each other. We simply nodded, signed our names, and shook hands. No kiss, no celebration. Afterward, I was escorted to my new room on the second floor. It was 3 times larger than my childhood bedroom, with soft gold curtains, cream-colored sheets, and a window overlooking the lake behind the house. The closet had already been filled with clothing in my size-neutral tones. Expensive fabrics, nothing I would have chosen. It wasn't until I stepped into the ensuite bathroom that I myself feel something. I stared at my reflection, not because I looked different, but because I didn't. I was still Emily Grace Bennett, just with a new last name no one had heard me say aloud. I remember sitting on the edge of the bathtub, fingers gripping the sink's edge. I whispered to the silence, "You're not a wife. You're an arrangement." And that night, when the door creaked open and I heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't ask why he came. I only listened and waited, because something in his steps told me I wasn't the only one holding my breath. Our first night sharing a room held no thunder, no lightning, no excuses born of alcohol or overwhelming passion, just quiet. Consuming, deafening quiet. He entered, as he always did, measured, contained, in control. He didn't knock. There was no need. This room, like the house, like me, had been signed over with a few pen strokes. I stood by the window, watching the lake beyond the trees. Moonlight's reflection danced faintly across the water. I didn't turn when I heard the door click shut behind him, but I felt his presence like cold air against my neck. "I won't take what isn't offered," he said quietly. My fingers tightened on the curtain's edge. I wasn't sure why. The words were kind, merciful, but they felt rehearsed, like something he'd said before to someone else. I turned around slowly. He stood near the bed, his jacket already folded neatly on the armchair. The top button of his shirt was undone. His eyes, gray, sharp, unreadable, rested on me with something that wasn't hunger and wasn't affection, just intention. "What if I don't offer anything?" I asked. He studied me for a long moment. "Then I'll leave?" I waited. He didn't move. "But I'll always wonder," he continued, "if your silence meant no, or if it meant you never knew how to say yes." My breath caught. He stepped forward. 1 step, then 2. I didn't back away. It wasn't desire that anchored me there. Not curiosity, not defiance, just stillness. The same stillness that had followed me since the day I signed my name beside. His daughter's hand reached out, stopped just short of mine. Fingers hovering close enough that I felt the warmth of his skin. Emily, he said, not a command, not a plea, just my name. As though he was testing how it tasted when spoken aloud. That was all it took. I didn't nod. I didn't speak. I released the curtain, and in that wordless permission, he closed the distance. He kissed me without warning, but not without care. His mouth was warm, steady, too practiced for a man who claimed to want silence. His hands found my waist like he'd imagined this moment long before it happened. My body reacted before my heart could catch up. Heat, tension, confusion, knotting together until I couldn't separate one from the other. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel: wanted, owned, seen. There was no urgency in him, just precision. He undressed me like someone who didn't expect resistance, but didn't take it for granted either. My nightgown pulled to the floor like spilled milk. I stood there naked under his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt claimed, and that frightened me more than anything. When he laid me down, he didn't speak. Not a whisper, not a breath wasted on explanation. His touch was clinical, deliberate, a man who knew what bodies did and how to make them respond, but hadn't yet learned that bodies were not just flesh. They were memory. They were permission. They were pain, and yet I didn't say no, because somewhere in the quietest, most hidden part of me, I needed to know if giving myself to him would make me feel something, anything. The pain was brief, but not gentle. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't look me in the eye when it happened. But when it was over and the room settled into silence again, I saw it just for a second in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way he exhaled like he had been holding his breath too long. Regret. Or maybe it was something worse. Relief. He stood, buttoned his shirt again, and turned toward the door. "You can sleep here if you like," he said, as opposed to where. I asked, my voice dry, brittle. He didn't answer. He left, and I lay there still staring at the ceiling. The weight of the sheets suddenly unbearable. In the morning, I found a single cup of tea on the nightstand. It wasn't hot, but it hadn't gone cold either, as if it had been brewed and placed there at the perfect moment. Just enough warmth left to say, "I thought of you," but not enough to say, "I waited." There was a note tucked underneath the saucer, only one sentence: "You don't owe me anything now." I stared at the words for a long time. My fingers trembled. As I folded the paper and slipped it into the drawer beside the wedding ring I still hadn't worn, I didn't cry that day. Not because I wasn't broken, but because I didn't know where the breaking began. That night changed something in me. Not just because I lost what most people called innocence, but because I realized that love was not always soft. That sometimes it entered without permission, took what it needed, and left you wondering if you were still whole. I wasn't angry at Nathaniel. I wasn't anything at all. And that was the scariest part. It began with the smallest sound. I had opened the top drawer of Nathaniel's desk, looking for a blank envelope to send a letter to my mother. I wasn't snooping, not really. I had lived in his house for over a month, slept in his bed only once, eaten dinner in silence more times than I could count. And still, I didn't know where the stationery was kept. The drawer slid open smoothly. There was nothing inside but pens, a notepad with a Hale family crest, and a small wooden box tucked against the back corner. It was a music box, old, carved from walnut, the kind with a hand crank, and a tiny ballerina standing in the center. Faded now, her dress chipped at the edge. I knew I shouldn't touch it. The air around it felt private, but my fingers reached before I could stop them. When I opened the lid, the melody creaked to life, slow, tentative, the kind of tune meant to soothe a child to sleep. It wasn't beautiful, but it was familiar. I'd heard it before. My mother used to hum it when I had trouble falling asleep, a tune, she said, from a music box she saw as a child, but never on. So how did it end up here? And then I saw the letter tucked beneath the lining of the box, just behind the ballerina's tiny feet. I pulled it out carefully. The paper was cream-colored, folded neatly, the edges softened with time. The handwriting on the front wasn't Nathaniel's. It said simply, "To her if she ever comes here." I sat down at the desk, heart racing in quiet rebellion, and unfolded the letter. "Dearest, if you are reading this, then you must be here in the place I once thought I would stay forever. You're not me, I know that. But if Nathaniel brought you here, it means you are braver than I was, or maybe softer. Either way, you are the one who will stay. Don't be fooled by his silence. He watches more than he speaks, feels more than he shows. He is a man who carries love like a secret he's afraid will ruin him if spoken aloud. He loved me once, but I was a storm he couldn't tame. You are the quiet after. And if you're here, it means he's still trying to love, even if he doesn't. Know how so be patient with him and with yourself. Love is a language some people learn late. Clara, his late wife, the woman I had never met, never spoken about, never seen photos of in the house. Her name had hovered like dust unspoken, always present, but this wasn't what I expected. From her, I read the letter again, slower this time, letting each line land with the weight it deserved. You are the one who will stay. That line stayed with me longer than it should have, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Not after that night. Not after weeks of polite avoidance and clipped sentences, but this letter cracked something. Not in Nathaniel, but in me. It made me wonder if everything I thought I understood was wrong. If maybe he hadn't just married me because of a deal. Maybe there was something else. Something he hadn't said. I folded the letter back up and placed it in my jewelry drawer. Not hidden just somewhere safe. That night at dinner, I watched him more closely. Nathaniel sat across from me, spooning soup without looking up. He wore the same kind of suit he always did. His cuffs were perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle on him, but his eyes looked tired. "Where did you get the music box?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He paused, spoon halfway to his lips. Then he set it down. "It belonged to Clara," he said. "Why?" I shrugged, just curious. He didn't ask if I'd opened it, and I didn't tell him I had. Not yet. Later that evening, I found myself outside the door to his study. I didn't knock. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there wondering who he really was, the man who took what he paid for, or the man who still kept music boxes with love letters hidden inside. I almost walked in, but then I heard it, the music. The same creaky melody playing. Softly from behind the closed door, he was playing it. Not from me for her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house, subtle wood groaning, wind whispering through the trees. And in that hush, I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since the wedding. Was I a replacement? Had he chosen me because I reminded him of Clara? Because I was the safe version of a woman he couldn't keep? And worse, was I falling for a man who hadn't chosen me at all? The next morning, he wasn't at breakfast. Mara, his assistant, handed me a sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this," she said. Inside was a short note. "You may redecorate the guest room. I won't use it. I'll be staying downstairs for a while." There was no explanation. No apology, no emotion, just distance wrapped neatly in perfect handwriting. I placed the note beside Claire's letter. And that's when I realized she was never trying to warn me about Nathaniel. She was trying to warn him about me. It started with a frame slightly tilted on the shelf. I wasn't meant to be in his study. After his note, we hadn't spoken for 4 days. Our interactions had been reduced to Mara relaying messages and meals. Left under silver lids on trays, the silence between us wasn't cold. It was suspended like a breath not yet exhaled. I entered the study to leave a file Mara had asked me to drop off. That was all. But then I saw the photo, a black and white image set in a simple frame. Leaning unevenly on the corner of the bookcase dot, it showed us schoolyard wooden benches, children with lunchboxes and grass-stained socks, a boy with unruly hair, a girl in the center, standing slightly apart, wearing a frayed cardigan, her eyes cast down, dot my breath caught. It was me at maybe 9 or 10, in the uniform of my old public school back in Ash Hollow. I remembered the day faintly, the awkward photographer, the sticky lemonade afterward. I had no memory of ever seeing Nathaniel that day, but the photo said otherwise. I lifted the frame with trembling hands. There was no note, no label, just silence. My fingers traced the glass, my throat tightened. Why was this photo here? How long had he kept it? And why had he never said anything? I confronted him that evening. I waited by the stairs until I heard the garage door open, then footsteps slow, even tired. He saw me before he even set his briefcase down. I found the photograph, I said. He didn't ask which one. He just closed his eyes. For how long? I asked. How long have you known me? Nathaniel leaned against the banister. The faintest flicker of something regret, fear moving behind his eyes. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. He looked at me for a long time. Then he walked past me into the study, leaving the door ajar. I followed. He sat at the desk and spoke without looking up. I visited your school when I was 27. It was a charitable visit. Clara was alive then. She had arranged the donation books. Computers. I went because she was too ill to travel. His voice was steady, almost mechanical. I remember being irritated. I didn't want to go, but then I saw you. He finally looked up. You were sitting by yourself under a willow tree, reading a book. You looked lost, not sad, not scared, just like you were waiting for something that wasn't coming. I swallowed, my hands curled into fists. I didn't know your name, he continued, not until years later. After Clara passed, I began donating to schools again. One day, your name showed up on a scholarship application. I recognized it immediately. I remembered the eyes. He paused, his jaw clenched. I watched from a distance, paid for what I could, never interfered. And then when your father approached me, I should have said no. Why didn't you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel looked at me like he was seeing the child again, not the woman standing before him, because I was already halfway in love with the ghost of a girl who read under trees and didn't know she was being watched. I turned away. The confession should have made things clear, but it only made the walls tilt. Had he married me because of kindness, guilt, obsession? I didn't know. And worse, I didn't know what it made me. An orphan in waiting, a charity case, a possession finally claimed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the house felt different now. It no longer echoed. It whispered. I stood by the window in my room, watching the wind stir the surface of the lake. I thought about the girl in the photograph, her dirty shoes, her missing buttons, the way she always hoped someone would notice, but feared what it meant if they did. That girl had never imagined she'd grow up to marry the man who noticed. She certainly never imagined he'd touch her without speaking. And she never imagined she'd want him to try again, but this time differently. The next morning, I went back to the study. The photo was gone. In its place was a new one, our wedding certificate, framed. The ring I never wore still sat in my drawer, untouched. I stared at the certificate, wondering what was real and what was arrangement, what was affection and what was duty. A soft knock pulled me from the thought. It was Mara. He's asked me to pass this on, she said, handing me a thin envelope. Inside was a single sentence. I never meant to haunt you, but I don't know how else to love. I held the letter in both hands, and I realized something strange. I didn't want to run. Not yet. Not anymore. Because for the first time, I saw Nathaniel not as the man who had taken me, but as the boy who had never learned how to keep anything he loved. The attic wasn't locked, but it felt forbidden. I hadn't been up there since I arrived. The house was large enough to lose yourself in without ever touching its top floor dot. That morning, after finding the letter and staring too long at the empty frame where my photograph had once stood, I needed to climb up. The stairs were narrow, creaking beneath my weight like they resented being remembered. Dust floated in columns of light from the skylights. The air smelled of cedar and old canvas dot, and then I saw it leaning against the far wall, half covered by a linen sheet. I didn't have to pull the cloth back to know what it was. Something in my chest already knew, but I pulled it anyway. The portrait was unfinished. My face looked younger, softer, rounder, like the Emily of 5 years ago. But it was unmistakably me. The curve of the jaw, the tilt of the chin, the same uncertain gaze I once caught in mirrors during nights I couldn't sleep. He had painted me. Not from memory, from watching. I reached out and touched the edge of the canvas as if the oils might still be wet, as if the silence in the room might shatter if I made a sound. He had started with my eyes. I could tell the detail was painstaking, as if even then he hadn't been sure what I would look like, just what I would feel like to him. Wanted, not owned, not traded, just wanted. When I returned to the main floor, I didn't look for him. I went to the garden instead. I needed sky above my head. Needed something bigger than the walls he'd kept between us. I sat on the stone bench under the old ash tree, watching the fountain ripple with the breeze. The sun felt too warm for October. Or maybe my skin was just waking up. I had been numb for so long, Dot. The footsteps came quietly behind me. I didn't turn around. You found it, he said. I nodded. It's not finished, I murmured. I know. Why didn't you? He didn't sit beside me. He stood a few paces back, as if still unsure whether he was welcome in his own story. I was afraid, he said, that if I finished it, it would become real. I looked up then. He looked older. In the daylight, not tired, just exposed. You were afraid of me? I asked, surprised. No, he said softly. I was afraid of needing you. We sat in silence for a long while, the kind that didn't hurt, the kind that stitched things back together. He finally sat down beside me. I used to think love was something you earned, he said, that it came after good behavior, after consistency, after years of knowing someone. But you, he shook his head. You shattered that. I turned to him. Why me? His eyes didn't waver. Because you made me remember what it felt like to hope. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't ready to forgive everything, but I was ready to stop pretending I hadn't been waiting for these words. And maybe I was ready to speak too. I used to think love was a rescue, I said quietly, that someone would come and fix everything. But I realize now it's not rescue, it's presence. It's staying even when it's hard. Nathaniel reached for my hand. He didn't grab it, he offered it, and I took it. That evening, I returned to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I had kept both letters, Clara's and his. I read them both again. I didn't cry, but I understood. Clara hadn't been a rival. She had been a mirror in a different frame, a woman who had loved the same man and who, in her parting, had made space for someone else to arrive whole. And Nathaniel, he hadn't needed a replacement. He had needed permission to try again. And I had needed to see myself through eyes that didn't ask me to become someone else. Later, I went to the studio beside the library. It was a room I hadn't dared enter until now. The canvas was still there beside his brushes and jars of oil. Pigment. I stared at the half-painted version of myself and whispered, I'm still becoming. Don't rush it. And in that whisper, I forgave us both. When he found me there, I didn't startle. He stood in the doorway, watching me the same way he once watched from afar. But this time, I watched back. You should finish it, I said. He stepped closer. Only if you let me paint you as you are now. I smiled. Then you'd have to see me. His voice was low. I already do. We returned to Ash Hollow just after the first frost. The train windows were fogged with the breath of early winter, and I spent most of the ride watching the trees blur by, trying to remember how it felt to belong to something before I belonged. To someone. Nathaniel sat across from me. We hadn't spoken much since I asked him to come home with me. Not to visit, not to escape, but to see where I came from, to see who I used to be, and maybe to see if he still wanted me when I wasn't standing in his house, surrounded by silence and soft lights and contracts no one read out loud. We arrived mid-morning. The house I grew up in looked smaller than I remembered, a little more crooked, the porch still leaning slightly to the left. Mama had planted chrysanthemums by the steps. They were yellow her favorite. Nathaniel opened the gate for me. He didn't ask if I wanted him to. He just did. When my mother answered the door, her eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but protection. She looked at him the way mothers look at men who've made their daughters quiet. Ma, I said gently, this is Nathaniel. He didn't offer his hand. He bowed his head. Ma'am, thank you for having me. Something shifted in her face then. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but recognition that this man, who once moved through boardrooms and courthouses like he owned the air, had learned how to lower his head when it mattered most. Inside, everything was just as I left it. The wallpaper, curling slightly at the corners, the couch with the middle cushion that sagged, the kettle on the stove that always whistled too soon. I made tea. Mama sat with Nathaniel in the living room, her hands folded around her knees, watching him like he might vanish if she blinked. You're quiet, she said after a while. Nathaniel nodded. Emily tells me that often. Good, Mama said. The men who talk the most often listen the least. He smiled just slightly. That night, we stayed in the guest room at the end of the hall. The same room I used to sneak into when thunderstorms made the walls feel too thin. Nathaniel didn't ask if he should sleep elsewhere. I didn't offer. We lay in the dark, not touching, not speaking, until he whispered, Your mother reminds me of you. She's stronger, I said. Not stronger, he replied. Just finished. I didn't sleep for hours, not because I was restless, but because I finally weighs in single quotes tea. The next morning, Nathaniel woke before I did. I found him in the kitchen, apron around his waist, standing over a pan of eggs he was definitely overcooking. The toast was already burnt. Is this your apology? I asked, leaning against the doorway. He looked up, sheepish.